So, welcome everyone back to the next session, the next technical session. My name is Sergey Weber. I'm the host of some of the sessions today, and I have the pleasure to be with Noel Lowdon, who will actually present a topic which I consider as black magic, which is forensics. So, Noel is working with Harper Shaw Investigation Consultants, where he is the CEO of. He's a vehicle systems forensics investigator for many years and provide trainings and on all things about forensics. Previously, he has been a detective and forensic collision investigator at the West Yorkshire or Yorkshire Police for more than 15 years, right? 17 years.
That's correct.
Noel, the stage is yours. Have fun.
Perfect. Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. As introduced, my name is Noel Lowdon, and I do a background investigating vehicles for serious crime or serious collision investigations. And today's presentation is going to surround the data that we've discovered on infotainment systems on some Mercedes vehicles. That has both implications, I guess, for serious crime investigation, but also security and cybersecurity risk as well, as to ways other crime types could be committed as well going forward. So some of this stuff is new to me as well, so I'm learning, and I'd welcome anybody's contributions from the audience to help me out in certain aspects, because it is a new area to me in some regards, being an investigator by trade and kind of coming into this arena the other way around, I guess, than studying it or going through automotive. I'm coming in from a different perspective. So, yeah, I set up the company back in 2016, having left West Yorkshire Police, and since then just had an eye on extracting data from vehicles for serious collision and serious crime investigations. I've recently set up an application that's available in both app stores that is a resource hub and training platform community for those people with an interest in vehicle system forensics as well, and spent many years investigating serious incidents, of which most involved a death, unfortunately. So today I'm just going to look at MBUX and the data acquisition process that we would carry out to get data from these systems. I'm going to look at AUTOSAR and DLT files that we are seeing in this infotainment system, the data types that we see, and then I'm going to talk through some validation and testing that we're having to do in order to make it robust for the criminal justice system, to know that we can rely on and understand this data a little bit better. So for those that aren't familiar, Mercedes infotainment systems generally to us go by the phraseology of NTGs, depending on which unit it is, and people may be familiar with the title command. Those acronyms standing for New Telematics Generation of Mercedes-Benz Cockpit Management and Data Systems. And the early sort of versions go back to around 1999, the NTG 2.5, all the way up to the NTG 5.5, before we moved into the NTG6, which is the MBUX infotainment system. And getting data from Mercedes infotainment systems is not necessarily something new. This has been occurring for the past, 7 to 10 years perhaps, where data has resided on these systems, but maybe they're in a different location to where they were in the past to a degree. There is a company called Burla that provides solutions, non-destructive solutions, to get data off these systems. And they started supporting modules at NTG 4.5. But at the moment, there is no support with their product for NTG6. So this is where we have to look to other solutions to try and establish whether or not there is data on this system. It got launched, interestingly, on the A-Class in 2018 here in the UK, so the back end of 2018, which is kind of unusual to a degree for a brand new infotainment system or platform, MBUX, as it was launched on some of the lower end vehicles, rather than it coming out on a high-end vehicle and then filtering down the range. And that kind of does have implications for us, because Mercedes A-Class is used by, or was used by, a lot of hire companies, and it's accessible cheaper than buying an S-Class perhaps, and having a lot of S-Classes on the road from a hire perspective. And we would see a lot of organised crime groups hiring vehicles to commit offences rather than using their own vehicles. So just for clarity, that is how the MBUX infotainment system presents on the A-Class, with the LCD screens, and that panel is running across the dash from the instrument cluster, and a separate screen for the infotainment on the right hand side. It's probably around the similar size of a number plate here in the UK. And the kind of things and services that infotainment system offers is obviously the connection of mobile devices these days, which is standard really. Augmented video for navigation, so the front camera on the A-Class is sometimes assisting with navigation, overlaying that camera view onto the mapping with something called MBUX Intelligent Voice Assistance, which is Hey Mercedes, and a lot of manufacturers going down that route. We've got from a manufacturer perspective, factor in road safety and keeping people's hands on the wheels. So obviously voice activated assistance is something that are prevalent in vehicles. Interior assistance, so gesture, so we maybe not having to reach as far in order to touch screens and start having to be tactile with them. We've got a hyper screen now in some of the MBUX systems that have come on since NTG6, where it's running right across the into the passenger side as well, so the passenger is getting an experience. Navigation as standard, and personalized experience as well, with a whole host of infotainment facilities that you would expect on a modern vehicle. So this system, as I've mentioned, came to market in the UK on the A-Class, and they were on the road from September 2018, and the first time we encountered one was in December 2018 for Greater Manchester Police in the north of the UK. And it's that type of scenario, somebody using a new vehicle from a hire company in order to commit, serious crime. In this case, it was kidnap and torture, which on each occasion was escalating against various different victims. And there was a real fear that, the next victim could be a murder victim. So quite serious criminal activities. And I guess the first difficulty we had with this system was a module location, because we couldn't find it to start off with. This is a module here, and it was located in a place in the vehicle that we didn't expect it to be. So whether that was by design for people not to find it, these things can be expensive to buy secondhand, and to steal them. If you're only having to remove one trim panel, then that's another factor, and that's another area of forensics and automotive thefts and parts from vehicles is another difficulty for us that we have to investigate. But yeah, the module location it's not where you'd expect it to be. It's in the driver's footwell, and it is a pain to get out. It really is a pain to get out, and there aren't really any instructions on getting it out. So they are problematic from that perspective. I just show the two pictures there because one is where the hard drive sits in that cradle at the front. So on previous Mercedes infotainment systems, we've seen hard drives that are actually, I don't say secreted inside, but they're within the shell. They're not open, and that will become a reason for discussion later in the presentation, really, as to why that might have not been the best design when we're looking at data acquisitions from a cybersecurity perspective. Once we've found the module, I hasten to add. So the hard drive that sits inside the top of that unit is either 200 gigabytes or 320 gigabytes. Harman Becker are the tier 1 manufacturer of the infotainment module itself. And we tend to find one of two hard drives inside there by different manufacturers, either HGST, which is Hitachi, part of Western Digital, or was part of Western Digital up until 2012, or Toshiba. And the difference between the 200 and 320 is one is an entry mid and the other is a high. So there'll be different services available depending on which of those two iterations you've got. So there are two versions of the NTG6. and those being the general difference, that we do see a bigger hard drive. That has implications for us as investigators as well. It's a SATA drive and it is locked. The unit itself, inside on the circuit boards, there is also an eMMC chip, 32 gigabyte, that does contain data as well, but that is quite well encrypted, but it does contain user data that I'm aware of. It is possible to access, but we generally go to the hard drive because that has the data that's probably replicated on the chip itself. So when we say the hard drive is locked, it's ATA locked, and essentially that means as soon as you remove that hard drive out of the cradle and you plug that into the computer to try and look at it, you can't see it. It doesn't present as you would if you put a USB into the computer. You can't see it. And you need the password in order to unlock that drive and then be able to see it. So that is, a secure method, and that's been going on for some time in the automotive industry. Hard drives are locked when you take them out. So we have to find a method to overcome that lock. And there are different ways in which we can do that. Burler themselves, when they are creating a solution for some of the infotainment systems, will come up with some workarounds in order to unlock those drives. So that is an option. There are other digital forensic tools. So those hard drives that are seen in the infotainment systems are just hard drives that you would see in the digital forensics world as well. And there are other digital forensic tools that can be used. However, they don't always work. The drawback to those two options really is that it's expensive to buy the tools or to buy the burler software. So for the people that either can't access those pieces of equipment or hardware and software to do that, we've got to look at other methods. The advantages and disadvantages to these methods are, if we're doing it in the vehicle, then we may be there a while. If we've got a 320 gig hard drive, that's probably going to take somewhere in the region to 3 to 4 hours for it to image. If we're doing it out of the vehicle and we've got a harness or we've got the CAN messages that we can replay, then obviously we've got the convenience of doing it in the office or in the lab, and we can be drinking coffee and we're not powering the car on itself. So there are alternative methods to do that hot swap method. We get a copy of the drive that way. So this is where my kind of learning comes now, because I've had to delve into this platform called AUTOSAR, which, as I understand, is an acronym for Automotive Open System Architecture and the standardised initiative for developing software architectures for automotive ECUs. Open and standardised software architecture that aims to promote interoperability, scalability, reusability of software components across different automotive platforms and suppliers. And I make no apologies about reading that out, because it is new to me. And as I understand it, and this is a slide that I will credit appropriately when I find the source of it again. But AUTOSAR was developed around in the early 2000s, and it's my understanding that it was there to give people a head start when they wanted to develop new ECUs, in the sense that there's some basic software written into that standard, whereby if we've got a tier 1 supplier to the automotive industry that wants to now start providing ECUs to another OEM, or the OEM wants to use another tier 1 provider, then they're not starting from scratch and having to write software from the ground up. So there is this standardized section, and they can just concentrate on the application software, what the OEM is dictating for those particular features of that ECU. Those in the audience may or may not be familiar with AUTOSAR, but this is taken from the AUTOSAR site and the 9 core partners, 65 premium partners, and you can see the major players within the automotive industry, and that will become relevant as we move on through the presentation. As we can see, some other infographics from their site enabling different suppliers to potentially get a head start. If you've got supplier A who's building chassis ECUs and supplier B is as well, then supplier B is not necessarily having to start from scratch when they're designing a chassis for another OEM. And again, that just highlights from the AUTOSAR site that we can reuse software modules across OEMs, increase efficiency of application development, invent new business models, and new entrant to market. They're not starting from scratch either. They can quickly get up off the ground to contribute to the automotive industry as well, I guess. And this is why it's not uncommon for us to see the same infotainment module in a group of vehicles. So we can see the same infotainment module itself in a Mini as we can in a Rolls-Royce, because they're part of the BMW group, albeit the applications might be slightly different at the other end. Perhaps the underlying software is, working in the same way, and that's increasing scalability and being able to develop new products quickly for market. And I find myself in AUTOSAR because of the files that we see on the hard drives of these Mercedes infotainment systems, which are termed DLT files. And when I was doing the research over what the DLT file was and where it came from, then it links me back into AUTOSAR. And AUTOSAR says that it's a file format, standardized way to log diagnostic and software events in a vehicle ECU. Unifies logging across components, aiding debugging issues, diagnosis, and performance analysis. Generated automatically, DLT files store data for analysis, enabling developers to understand software behavior and optimize performance. So I guess it's probably important to make the distinction that the diagnostic issues might not be diagnostic issues with a vehicle if you were to plug into the OBD port. These are probably to do with the development of the ECU and things that are going on with the ECU to improve it as it's going forward by those software engineers that are responsible for the design and implementation of infotainment systems. And it's in these files, and as a result of the files that these create, that we see some of the data that we find on these drives. Just for reference, that is what the drive looks like under the flip side of the cradle that sits into that unit. And I guess just going back to the design thing of the unit itself, because I can take that out and plug in, as we saw in the car, if I just jump back to that picture, quite easy for me to get that cable into that void in order to do that process. If the hard drive had been inserted into the unit itself from a physical design perspective, then obviously to get that cable into the back of a void is a lot more difficult. And we see that on other infotainment systems. It's not impossible, and there are ways to work around it. But from a design perspective on a physical part, then perhaps that drive could have been put into a different place in the physical architecture of the unit itself, notwithstanding knowing where people need motherboards, etc., inside the unit, but it had been done in the past. So once we start to look at the data that we get from these systems, on the left-hand side, you can see the EEL folders, and then we've got these folders called HU underscore, and then a 242 at the top, and then what is the date and time, and then a tag GZ. Once I get inside there, as you can see, I've opened one up, then I have these DLT offline trace files, which you can see are around 8 megabytes, and they're quite big. So that's it in its raw format, in its hexadecimal format. Once we have a look at those in a text format, then you can see that's now showing at 9.4 megabytes. And if you look on the right-hand side, we start to see these data types. You can see where it's highlighted sort of the spelling mistakes for coordinate, and we've got a latitude in there, we've got a longitude, we've got a height, below that we've got a wheel angle, we've got wheel circumference, we've got a vehicle, well, I've got a speed value, we've got a vehicle speed changed. That is one hell of a text file for me to manually go through and to search through that. I've obviously above those coordinates got date and time. So it would appear that when these files are being created, then other data that's potentially on the vehicle or is being fed to these systems from other ECUs is being captured in these files as well. I've got a supply battery voltage changed as well. What's interesting data from a forensic point of view when we're looking at trying to put vehicles in locations at various dates and times. That's a problem for us because that's a lot of data to manually sort through. I would need somebody that's a lot cleverer than me to write a script to start looking for all that information. And I will credit some colleagues in Europe that have helped me out with regards to devising a script in order to be able to do that from an automated process rather than doing it manually as we were in the first place. Those people know they are if they're listening. But we've no real way of understanding what is reliable and understanding the source of it for criminal investigations. So how do we put this into evidence? How do we, when I'm asked what's the provenance of this data and what does it mean, how am I going to be able to do that? Well, I have to go and buy one of these vehicles. So in the early part of this year, February, we bought a Mercedes A-Class and started to run it, because the nuances of those creation of those files is that they can just be created at any given time, and we didn't know what the recording trigger was for them. So we've had to buy a vehicle and then run it in order to see whether or not it does create any of those files while we've got it, and then go back. And jumping straight into the deep end, I guess this is some of the data that we've seen from those systems. And obviously this is our data, because these are files that have been created while we've been in possession of that. So on the right hand side, what you've got there is a load of images which have come from my iPhone that's been connected to the vehicle, only via Bluetooth, not by cable. Here, isn't to add, it's only a Bluetooth connection that it's had. But for anybody out there that's got an iPhone and you've got somebody saved as an image in your contacts, as I have for my mum, then that's come over onto that hard drive as a result of that creation of the DLT file. Some of those images can be other people's images as well. They're not necessarily mine, because it's what they've saved as their contact image on their phone. So with images that are on there that could be useful for criminal investigations, because we're attributing people to a vehicle. Other data types we see are destinations entered to the sat-nav, and we get times associated with those. Those are the date and time of the DLT creation, with date and time that was input to the sat-nav as well. And I can corroborate that from using the vehicle and knowing that when I've entered a destination to the sat-nav, it was the date and time I entered it in. That can be really significant in criminal investigations. If we've somebody putting in a destination at a given time, if it's just before the commission of an offence at that location. With some vehicle events, so in this file, or in this section, we see doors opening, door closing, when time's been updated, odometer readings, when phones have been connected, and these are all being created when those DLT files have been created. Those can be really useful for obvious reasons in a criminal investigation. And GPS fixes, once we start plotting those, we're starting to see the route that the vehicle was going on, and I can confirm that was a journey that we were on at the time at those locations. So again, and that can be significant in criminal investigations. When we look at paired phones, then we're obtaining data such as Bluetooth MAC addresses, the friendly name of the device, the IMEI number for the device, the IMSI, and the device ID. So quite a rich picture in order to advance further investigations. And then the call history from the device. So these are recent call logs that are on my device that have been taken off the device. Well, not taken off, but they've obviously synced with the vehicle's infotainment system for convenience. I get that. But obviously these have been captured in the DLT files as well. So we need to do the validation and testing really to understand these and to know that they're accurate. We've got big things going on in the UK with regards to ISO standards in forensic activities, and one of the big things is understanding and validating data that we see on vehicles. So this is why we bought this vehicle and why we've been running it. From March up until June, we did 3,000 miles in those 3 months. And when we bought the vehicle, it had done 146,000 miles. Yes, we did buy a vehicle, but we were getting one as cheap as we could. But interestingly, having a vehicle with that mileage on it as well allowed us to see that it had already had 220 instances whereby those EEL folders have been created. Obviously, we've got the previous history from the other owners of the vehicle. When we run the vehicle, some of those have been deleted. So we're able to understand that the system is overwriting them. It's only got a limited capacity for storing those type of things. We've been able to confirm that the GPX fixes that are in there are where the vehicle was at those times, notwithstanding the nuances that you get with GPS data sometimes not being only accurate due to environmental factors. The event data stuff is still ongoing. If you can imagine, we've done 3,000 miles. We don't know when these systems are going to create the DLT files. We want to try and establish if we know a situation when and where they might be created. So we have had instances where active lane assisters come in and where automatic emergency brakings come in. But I think from memory, we still need to go through that. There isn't a correlation between those type of activities going on. And as it's said in the sort of definition of a DLT file, they can be generated automatically. And it's really difficult to understand all the different things you can do in a vehicle, change the radio, for example, or put the indicator on, to then know exactly what was going on and the status of the vehicle at the time without having cameras in there 24/7. We're into the next round of testing now. The vehicle is still being run so that we can, it's not just a one-off, and we can see whether or not what we think from the first round is right, and then there's no anomalies, to give more context to it. And then we'll probably do a final 3 months as well after that, just to see what we get on the second time, so that we've got a really good understanding of these things if we're going to put them into the forensic arena of a court case. And it's very time-consuming work for us going from start to finish with all this, and then we will write up an official research paper. But we wanted to get this first round of results out at this type of event so people could see what was going on. What are the implications for this as a bit of a wrap-up? Lots of data are being stored, both personal and vehicle performance by DLT. We've not even started to look at some of those things we saw about vehicle speed, etc. It's not manufacturer specific, this. As we've seen, AUTOSAR is used in many different manufacturers, and I am aware of seeing these type of files in Kia and Hyundai vehicles, also in PSA group vehicles. So the problem could be bigger than you think across the automotive cybersecurity, from an automotive cybersecurity perspective. And it just depends how you're thinking about this. If you're an investigator of a serious crime, you're going to say, great, that's brilliant, that's there. But we've got to think a little bit differently. If I'm a target of somebody and they know that I own one of these vehicles and I go and sell that vehicle, then by using these methods, then obviously a lot of personal data can be obtained from the vehicle to facilitate other crime types and fraud. And we've got to think about national security. What are police forces, what are armed forces, people of prominence doing with their vehicles when they're disposing of them at the other end? There's no method of wiping it other than taking that unit out and throwing it in the canal or in the river. A factory reset is not going to get rid of that data through the methods that we've shown and demonstrated today, really. So it does have wider implications for the whole of the automotive industry, where the AUTOSAR platform is being used. And it's over to the community, really, to see how that can be, how that can be resolved to a degree. Those are my contact details if anybody wants to reach out, but I will be available to take sort of questions. I'm not sure where we're at, but I guess I could be out of time. I'm not sure how well I've timed that because I've not been in the chat room, but I'll come back now and see what's going on.
So it takes a while to click all the buttons. So thanks, Noel, for your very interesting presentation. And we have questions, and I have at least two, because as I said, I consider this topic a little bit as black magic. So allow me the first question before we come to the questions of other attendees. So how to break in headfirst into forensics? So what are the maybe 3 first steps to do in order to learn about that?
That's a really good question, because there's no real direct line into automotive forensics, really. You're coming into it from one of two backgrounds. You're either involved in computer forensics and you've experience of looking at these hard drives and file systems that are contained on computers in general, or you're in the automotive industry investigating crashes or insurance assessors, claims, or a technician at a dealership or something of that nature. But those two people probably don't understand each other's work, if you see what I mean. And then you've got to overarch that with process and procedure to show that what you're doing is accurate, repeatable, and can withstand scrutiny within the courtroom. So I'm trying to speak with universities here in the UK to try and look at how we could facilitate, people coming into that area. But I think automotive cybersecurity and the people that are involved in that kind of thing and design have got something to add to this and can accelerate a lot of the joining up between those two sort of areas how people typically get into automotive forensics. We've put a training package together for people that takes them through sort of planning and examination, looking at what vehicle they've got, what tools they've got at the disposal and techniques to get the data off, and then understanding the nuances of the data going forward. And that's very much in its infancy as well. And I've got one foot in either camp trying to get the Institute of Motor Industry here in the UK to give me some sort of validation on the training, but also people within the digital sphere as well. So we can try to bridge that gap. But the two worlds are very distinct, and you probably end up with specialists at one end, specialists at the other. But to have somebody with the overall, it would probably require a new training package of some description, whether it be degree level or otherwise.
I understand. So it's a little bit more difficult as I expected, but I think the topic is also a little bit more difficult. So allow me another question. So if we look at UN Regulation 155, there's a chapter 7.3, and there's a requirement, which is, and I paraphrase, the requirement is telling us measure to support data forensics are in place. What is your expectation or your observation? Is it something which is already on its way to implement that requirement? Have you observed that?
I'm aware of certain. It's difficult sometimes for me as an independent commercial company sometimes to know exactly what's going on between OEMs and law enforcement and national security, globally to a degree. I think there has been some conversations in the past, but they need to be, picked up and gone forward. And I think things are changing very, very quickly at the moment. And I guess the difficulty that you have globally is you've got OEMs in one country, you've got law enforcement in another, and it's very fragmented to a degree. The number one priority has got to be automotive cybersecurity to make these vehicles safe that are starting to become autonomous, that, people's lives are the single most important thing that we've got to get right. If we can't investigate a crime because we can't get data off a vehicle, we have to look to more traditional methods. People have been committing crimes for years and years and years, and we've still managed to investigate them. For me, that has to take priority. But and similarly, we've seen it in the mobile phone industry as well, that Apple will not necessarily give the keys to their kingdom to law enforcement, because as soon as they do that, then you're going to compromise other areas and people's privacy and people's security. So there has to be some form of work between the two. And it's difficult, because if I take another example, crash data, which is just 5 seconds worth of vehicle speed, steering angle, braking input, and some various other parameters, we're still not there on disclosing that detail from all the manufacturers at the minute. Certainly here in Europe, different in the States. So if we can't get that, how at the moment, and that's still going through some processes to make it a legality. The struggles that we've had just on that side, and for example, in Europe, they're not even wanting to disclose the VIN as part of the crash data read, which is kind of balmy in some respects when the VIN's in most windscreens of vehicles. And if we're trying to reduce the number of people that die on our roads, and giving us the crash data or 5 seconds worth is going to improve those investigations and hopefully go forward to reducing that. So I think, you can look at one aspect of the industry, such as crash investigation, look at the difficulties that industry is having here in Europe of getting just that data. When we look at the other side and the regulations around automotive cybersecurity 155, then the manufacturers, rightly so, are going to concentrate on making things as secure as they do, for risks to be inhibited or minimized as much as they can. You'll never obviously be risk-free, but you've got to minimize those as much as you can. And then there's got to be an element of trust between, law enforcement and the manufacturers if you are going to make some lines of communication in there to obtain data.
Understand. So I have let's say, follow-on question from Chris. I will just briefly show it. So what exactly is legal allowed to log?
That's a very good question.
It's a very difficult question, of course. Is it
That
everything?
is a very good question, because
what
these
GDPR allows us, or is it something else?
No, well, I guess the example that we've given here today is those things getting logged are just as a byproduct of a system that's been designed to do something completely different, and for people to understand the architecture of the system, what the software is doing, and debugging issues, etc., etc. But as to what regard is exactly is legally allowed to log, it's a difficult one to answer. You can get into the far end of the infotainment screen and read all the manufacturers' documentation on data privacy and the fact that you will, but it's not that explicit that potentially things are going to be stored. And don't forget, this data is being logged on this module as a physical module that I could take out of the vehicle, and I have. This vehicle's also got a telematics control unit on it, which I don't know whether those files are being sent off the vehicle as well, back to manufacturer or third party, at a back end. So you would think that somebody somewhere has got something written down as to what's legally allowed, but I don't know. You've got to think that if I want to put convenience into a car whereby my call history is in the user interface, so that I'm not having to fumble about to type the number in that I want to call, and I don't have to go through my contacts to find the contact to make the call. That's a convenience feature to make the driver safer and to be less distracted. But as a byproduct of doing that, it's got to mean that the infotainment system's got to store that. Then personal data is going to be on there, and whether that's legal or not is another matter. That there could be some safeguarding going on around what you allow to go onto your vehicle as well.
I understand. That's a difficult question, and it's not an easy answer. I'm going to show you another question. Just briefly, let me click on that. From Andre. So, can you say more about the apparent lack of collaboration with car makers and what your experience is about getting access to design information via the car maker? So it's a little bit close to the questions we discussed previously.
Yeah. Well, it's only my opinion. The automotive industry at the moment is going through such a transformation, and I guess they're not really car makers anymore. They're service providers, and they're all trying to do their own thing to a degree. So the lack of collaboration with car makers sometimes could be down to profitability and not wanting to share the methods of their, architecture and what they are doing. Inside, even with just one vehicle, I can have not so much on this that we've done the presentation about, but other platforms of vehicle, I can have the same infotainment that's coming out as the user interface, whereby you've got two cars next to one another, and from a user perspective, they're exactly the same. But I can have two different tier one providers who have made the infotainment module itself, and the architecture inside those modules are completely different component. Well, not different components, but again, from a tier two provider, different manufacturers and got different nuances. Getting access to design information via the car maker, very, very, very difficult in order to understand that. You've some areas that you can go to online to see some of the manuals for these things, but the design, some of the testing might be shown on there just for like Bluetooth and the strength of the signals that are being given off by these things to show that they're safe. But for me as an independent practitioner, my law enforcement colleagues who are maybe a little bit closer to the OEMs and may start to see some more of that. But as an independent practitioner, I don't see it so often.
I understand. Maybe the next question is a little bit closer to your let's say practitioner point of view. How common are such investigations right now? Are investigators aware of all those data?
Okay, so we've been practicing since 2016, and
2016,
it sometimes still feels like we've only just begun. It depends on the investigator. There are some really good and really experienced investigators globally around vehicle infotainment systems, and they've been seen in some really high-profile cases across the globe. But there are still relatively new investigators to roles that don't understand the extent of what some vehicles are storing and how that can assist serious crime or serious collision investigations. So the investigations are common, certainly for me as an independent and a company that serves the UK nationally with regards to law enforcement, because it seems to be a kind of trigger as a serious investigation unfolds. Then, as you would do years ago and say, we're going to do a house-to-house inquiry, people are saying, well, we need to download phones, we need to download cars. What can we get from this car? So we do spend a lot of our time sort of triaging what is available on a vehicle, given the tools that we've got, and knowing what it stores and how sure we are that the data means what it does when we do get it out, so it could be used in a court case.
Understand. And the last but not least question is, an experienced criminal might try to modify the data to prove himself innocent. Do you think this is possible?
Yeah, we see that. Interestingly, the kind of two areas within law enforcement to a degree that I keep trying to link together. So we've got some very sophisticated criminals that steal cars. Okay, so we look at the basic form of a cybersecurity risk on a vehicle, and the relay attack might be classed as one of those, or CAN injection, as we've seen in previous presentations today from the likes of Ken and Ian, who tell their story around how Ian's vehicle was stolen. So if they can make the modifications to steal the vehicle, then there is the knowledge to make modifications in other ways as well. So for example, previously when you stole a vehicle, you might put some false number plates on it. Whereas when you steal a vehicle now, you would maybe put the false number plates on, and a good criminal, an experienced criminal, then might electronically manipulate the ECUs to that VIN of the registration number that you've put on as a stolen vehicle. So even if you start to, interrogate it electronically, then those could have been changed. And data emulation, is really significant. And this is why we have to do this kind of research, so we know what we're looking for, we know what went on in the real world, and we can start to identify whether or not there has been data manipulation. But they'll do that in a number of different ways, which is not really for public discussion for me to reveal some of the tactics that we do see in respect to some of the experienced criminals.
I understand. So you mean this discussion needs to be a little bit more private, right? So I would like to invite everyone to the lounge to discuss some topics with Noel in private. So feel free to join there. All the shy people who did not ask the question have their chance now. Thanks, Noel, for the great presentation, and looking forward to hear more of you. Bye-bye.
No problem.